to our family and parenting corner. We do it every Thursday to unpack the different dynamics of families and parenting here on the African continent. And today we're going into a conversation that's quite important. A lot of times parents are becoming more intentional about being parents, and we have a plan. We want to have a plan. We say, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to raise my child. But unfortunately, there's so many children in the world who are born and raised under really difficult circumstances. Some of those circumstances are financial. In fact, many of them here on the African continent are financial. We know that a majority of Africans live below the poverty line, but there's so many other social ills that could affect children within the family dynamics. Sometimes it is abuse, sometimes it is financial, and these could really have a terrible effect on how that child becomes and how that child moves through life. But sometimes, in fact, in our own family dynamics here on the African continent, I feel like there is a system that we've always put in place where, as family members, we sort of step in situations that we see aren't really great for that particular child. But not all of them are done in a legal way. But we're taking a look at a more legal perspective of parenting. This is a form of adoption that isn't permanent but is quite temporary, and it's called becoming a foster parent. It's a temporary care for a child whose biological parents are unable to care for them at a particular time, and it's also one of the most selfless and life-changing decisions that anyone can take. It's a journey filled with both hope and complexity where love meets the legal systems. We're unpacking foster parenting in today's Family and Parenting Corner on The Move. Joining us on the line is child protection activist and director of For the Voiceless, which is a child protection non-profit company. Robyn Wolfson joins us. Thank you so much for your time, Robyn. How are you?
Thank you, Palesa, and good morning to your listeners. I'm very well, thank you. I hope you are too.
This foster parenting sounds like a complicated legal system and a complicated word, but I think it's something that sort of always existed, especially on the African continent, where we have the Ubuntu system, or the system of, community raising children. And in most family dynamics on the African continent, we find that if there is a parent that cannot take care of a particular child, they say, well, send them to the grandmother, send them to this aunt, send them to this cousin, send them over here. This person might be better equipped to take care of this child. But of course, that is not legal, and it also doesn't guarantee that that child will be raised under better circumstances. We find ourselves in so many dire situations, from financial situations and all forms of abuse. So let's speak about that. What is it that that people would see, or a particular legal system would see, that would need a child to go under the foster parenting system?
Okay, so I think you raised some very important points. Maybe we can just unpack them quickly.
Yes.
So, as you correctly say, in the South African and the African context, we have what we call kinship foster care, which is mostly an informal arrangement where you have a child who for whatever reason cannot be cared for by their biological family or their biological parents. And therefore, what we do is we move that child into another situation where another member of the family or a member of the community cares for them. And as you say, often that works incredibly well, in the sense of we are very community oriented as a country. And in many cases, we find that those children are very, very well cared for. The problem with it is that it is an informal system. So there isn't a lot of oversight associated with it. So that is fine, provided that child is safe and well cared for. The problem comes in where there might be a situation where that child is either being neglected or for whatever reason not being abused or not well taken care of. So often what we find is that it's more effective when a child is in a situation where the parent can't care for them for any reason, that they're put into what we call the formal foster care system, which is the legal foster care system. And in this country, the way that it works is it is specifically a temporary solution for a child that is in need of care and protection. So what we want immediate action. If we know that a child is at risk or vulnerable, we want that child removed from that situation. We want a social worker involved. We want a court order that then places them into temporary foster care with a vetted foster care parent who can look after them for a period of time. And our goal with foster care is always to say, let's do whatever we can to restore that child back to the family, provided that family is a safe and stable and kind environment where that child can be kept and looked after. So foster care kind of stands in the gap, helps those parents get back on their feet, and hopefully helps that child be restored back into the family unit at the end of that process.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because foster care can be very confused with the adoption process in itself. Can you relate the two and their differences and their similarities?
Okay, and that's a brilliant question, and I think really important for your listeners to understand that. So there are two very big differences between foster care and adoption. The first big difference is that adoption is a permanent relationship. So in other words, what happens is when a child is placed into an adoptive family, they undergo, and this is the second point, they undergo a permanent legal change to their identity. So when the adoptive parents get an adoption order for that child, they also get a letter which says that this child is yours as if born to you. So what that means is that they are now effectively, although they're adoptive parents, they are effectively, to all sense and purposes, they are now the legal parents of that child. And what that child will end up having is a change to their ID number and a change to at least their surname. Sometimes parents will change the first name of the child as well. So adoption is a permanent relationship. And what happens with adoption is that child is removed actually from the child protection system at that point. They're no longer deemed to be a child that is as a ward of the state, and they're no longer deemed to be in need of care and protection. Foster care is quite different from that. So foster care is atemporary. What you will do is you'll get a foster care order, which is usually about 2 years long. There are times when the courts will extend that foster care order because they see that there is unlikely to be a situation where that child will be restored to their family unit in a shorter period of time. But normally that will only be for 2 years, and then you've got to go back to court in order to get that renewed. There is no legal change to the identity of that child. And that child, for the period of the foster care order, actually remains in the child protection system and remains a ward of the state. That child is not your child, even though as a foster parent, you might do absolutely everything that a parent or an adoptive parent would do.
Sure.
That child is still not legally your child. So those are the biggest and the most important differences. The other thing which is really important to understand about foster care is that it only endures until the age of 18 or until that child has finished formal schooling. And at that point, the child actually, what we call the ages out of the foster care system. Whereas with an adoptive child, that child is always your child in perpetuity.
All right, we need to take a break, Robyn. Thank you so much for, explaining that. I think it's very important to define the differences between foster parenting and adoption. But let's go into the legalities of foster parenting, what is necessary to know, to understand, both from the foster parent's perspective, but from the biological family of the child as well. So stay with us. We're going to take a short break and we'll continue this conversation after this.
Embrace our young voices. This month, Channel Africa, celebrating Youth Month. Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine, weekdays 6 till 9.
In recent weeks, East Africa has seen a disturbing rise in human rights violations. In Kenya, digital activist Rose Njeri was arrested under the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act after creating a tool for citizens to oppose the Finance Bill 2025. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, Kenyan activist Boniface Mwangi and Ugandan lawyer Agatha Atuhaire Haire reported being detained, tortured, and sexually assaulted by security officers.
East Africa needs a reset. We need to get back East Africa to where the founding fathers are. When President Nyerere and his colleagues, Jomo Kenyatta and the Ugandan counterparts fought for independence, they fought for independence to get Africans out of poverty, to get Africans out of slavery. The leaders who took up power have since gotten into regression.
Neto Agostino, co-leader of the United Green Movement Party.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine.
On the Move, weekdays, 9 a.m. to midday.
Only on Channel Africa. #On the Move.
Hey, you're listening to the Thursday edition of On the Move. You're listening to us right here on Channel Africa. And we are on our live stream. Joining us on that live stream on our YouTube page and also on our Facebook page is Robyn Wolfson. If you want to get into that interaction, you can join us on those platforms. Robyn is a director of For the Voiceless. That's a child protection non-profit company. She's also a child protection activist. While I was asking a little bit more about the differences between foster parenting and adoption were deliberate, because in our African context, we do foster care and adoption in very kind of blurry ways, Robyn. But you are talking more around the formal way of foster parenting. Because of the nature of how it is in African communities, can a cousin or an uncle or an aunt be the foster care guardian? How does that work in the legal system? Because at times we do this in a very informal way. And from a cultural perspective, as Africans, we'd rather as a family do the foster caring than leave the child to get out of the nucleus family. I'm sure you've experienced that a lot in the African context. How does that work?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that to a large extent, that is accommodated within the framework of the law, at least in South Africa. I can't really speak to the other countries in Africa.
Sure.
But I think we actually had a very interesting situation in South Africa where about 25 years ago, the then Minister of Social Development actively encouraged family members from extended families to use the foster care system to a degree formalize those relationships with their children. Now, that unfortunately had a bad outcome because we had so many children who were in those types of relationships that eventually the foster care system actually fell over and collapsed.
How so? Were there too many applicants, or what was happening there?
There were too many. There were just too many children in the system. And our system, which had been designed for approximately 25,000 vulnerable children to 50,000 vulnerable children, suddenly had close to 1 million children sitting in the foster system. So we had to tease out what is it that we want to do when it comes to children who are in kinship situations. Now, what we want to do is we want to make sure that there is somebody who can make decisions for those children. And really, for that person to be a formal guardian works as effectively as if they were a foster parent. The other thing is that we recognize that there are some poverty-related issues, particularly if we've got like a granny who is now having to look after a whole lot of grandchildren and she's using her pension. And so one of the reasons we brought those children and those families into the foster care system was because we could give them a foster care grant, which is a part of fostering in South Africa.
Okay.
But because the system collapsed, what we now have is we call something called a CSG top-up, which is a child support grant top-up in South Africa. So what we're saying is, let's give you some additional income to support your kinship care relationship. But let's not put you into the formal court system because you don't need it. You don't need to be getting court orders every 2 years. You don't need a social worker to write a report about you. All we need is to know that that child is cared for and protected. And if for whatever reason they aren't, then we know that will be reported into the child protection system. So in fact, these systems, we're actually having to work out how to best understand in an African context how to keep children safe, but not over control families where something has been working for a very long time.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that, because I'm wondering also the other side of it in terms of maybe there is a parent who has been rehabilitated, maybe through the criminal justice system, maybe they've rehabilitated themselves to actually now take care of that foster child. What's the process of assessing the health of that biological parent and getting the child back into a more traditional household? Tell us a little bit about how that system works, and also that detachment between the foster parent and the foster child when that process of fostering actually comes to an end.
So I think that, again, will vary from area to area. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what the theory is. In theory, when a child enters the child protection system, they have a social worker, either designated by the government or alternatively by a child protection organization. And that social worker is the custodian of the whole family, in the sense of it's that social worker's responsibility to make sure that the biological parents, if they need to be rehabilitated, they go through whatever that process is. You mentioned the criminal justice system. It might be there might be a drug addiction problem. Sometimes it's just poverty. It's just simply the lack of ability for that parent to be able to afford to take care of that child. So the hope is that what the social worker will do is work actively with those parents to get them back to the place where that child can be restored to them. If there has been a violent interaction, if that child is unsafe, we obviously need to address that. We look at positive parenting programs. We look at all sorts of really important interventions. Unfortunately, let's just say it. So that is the theory. The reality is we don't have enough social workers in South Africa. Probably that's, again, an African-wide problem. And so sometimes what actually happens is the children are restored to those families and they're not safe yet. And we do have some really tragic outcomes in those stories. But let's just say that in the best case scenario, we have a situation where that parent is rehabilitated and able to raise that child. Then what will happen is at the end of that 2-year period where the child has been in has got a foster care order, or alternatively, sometimes it happens a bit sooner, the social worker will approach the foster care family and say that we want to proceed with with restoration of this child to their family. And again, in theory, they will slowly but surely transition that child back into the family. Sometimes that does not happen. Sometimes children get removed. The foster parent will get a phone call and the child will be removed that afternoon. There are some, it is something which is very, very hard to process. Foster parents are my heroes because they walk around with their hearts outside of their bodies all the time, because they do get incredibly emotionally attached to those children. But it is one thing that you need to be prepared for if you are in the formal foster care system, is that the goal is always to restore that biological family, and that involves some loss for you as a parent.
Robyn, we've run out of time. This has been interesting. I'm sure there's so many other themes we can capture. But if we want to find out more about the work you do at For the Voiceless, where do we go?
So I have a website. You can find me on forthevoiceless.co.za. And you can also email me if you're interested in chatting some more at Robyn, ROBYN, at forthevoiceless.co.za, or you can find me on Facebook or X.
Thank you so much for your assistance on this one. So many questions, and I think we can do a follow-up on this one. I'd love us to focus maybe one day on being the foster parent, because that is also just a topic all by itself, and I'm sure that we can tackle that some other time in our parenting feature. Well, that was Director for the Voiceless. That's the name of the organization, a child protection non-profit company, Robyn Wolfson. Well, it's 10:31 Central African time. It's time for us to quickly move on. Let's find out what's happening in the sports with Fikile Lingwati.